This is Clio, and you're listening to my podcast, Bread and Circuses with Clio. Now, I think this is the first time I haven't called it my new podcast because I think I started it over a year ago. But now it's different. We're actually going to take it seriously because TikTok might not be around for much longer, and I gotta think about the future. I'm live streaming this and I'm trying to ignore it at the same time, but okay. Today's podcasting episode is called Capital Punishment. Now, as I told the live streaming audience just now, it is a play on words, a double entendre without the sexual connotation. And as I say, I love double meanings, and today is going to be filled with double meanings. What inspired today's episode is probably the most amazing book I've ever read. So the book is called Discipline and Punish. It took me forever to read, partly because I'm reading multiple books at once. And Discipline and Punish is a philosophical work by Michel Foucault, who is now probably one of my favorite human beings to ever exist. You ever read a book and you think to yourself, this person understands it, this person gets it. And that's how I feel about Michel Foucault. He was a French philosopher. He was a post-structuralist, and he wrote about something called the panopticon, which is basically this societal surveillance system. Now, I often in my videos reference a surveillance system. There were so many moments when I was reading this book where I was just shocked at how I never quite thought of it that way, but when it was put into words, it was very obvious. Like, for instance, this actually wasn't scripted, this part, but when I was in college, I remember I had a lecture and we talked about this concept. It was actually a Shakespeare literature class, if you can believe I was in that. Shakespeare is actually not that bad. Everyone else in his era was. So I remember we discussed this concept of the king has two bodies. And it was basically to highlight how Queen Elizabeth I was able to ascend the throne. Now, because, the English Civil War and there was a religious contention at that time in England. And, why is it that a woman was able to become queen? There are plenty of countries where a woman's never been queen. And coincidentally, in England, or the UK, there have been queens. And it all comes back to this idea of the king has two bodies. Now, Elizabeth's argument is that, yes, she has inhabited the corporeal form of a woman. However, she is, there is an ethereal, a spirit of a king that she can inhabit, and that's how she is able to justify her throne. And Foucault has a subversion of this idea of the king has two bodies. And this comes down to how society handles punishment and how we inflict it. And a lot of it is self-conditioning, some of it is surveillance. So the king has two bodies. So there was something he talked about, kind of like the double body of the prisoner and the king. Even though in society we have de-escalated and removed the theatricality of public execution, it does not mean that there is no more discipline and punish in our prison systems, in our school systems, even hospitals. When you think about it, he talks about how medical records almost function as a kind of criminal record, as a way to define you. It's such an amazing book, honestly. The king has two bodies. When we're talking about these polarities, the polarities of society, who is the very top and who is the very bottom, we see that this concept of the theatricality of the coronation, the theatricality of the kind of excess rulership in society, it's kind of played at least in this kind of public execution, similarly, where you have the theatricality of the delinquent, the theatricality of the punishment of the people who are not obeying within a certain law. So The king has two bodies, one in the prisoner and one in the king. I thought that was an amazingly brilliant concept because I've been aware of this concept for many years, but it was such a subversion of it. Now, to get to the more crux of what we're talking about today, I find the word execution to be very interesting. And I think, generally speaking, if there is double meanings in words, there's a reason. I'm not sure, I once knew what this was called. But it's essentially the theory that when two words are homophones or they relate in some way, that it's not coincidental, that there is a reason behind it. And I think the word execution kind of, if we think about it from the discipline and punish, on the one hand, it means to do. When we talk about, if you think about it, even in like a corporate workspace, you'll hear this all the time. We need to execute this procedure flawlessly. Well, you could say the exact same sentence about sentencing someone to death. And that's why I think it's interesting we have this duality of the word execution. Because, we have, on the one hand, it's something that's very regimented, something that's very structured. And on the other, it's the taking away of life by the state. And, I remember when I was about 13, I was in actually a Jewish youth group, but, we used to talk politics. And I remember being asked the question, which is, do you support the death penalty? Do you support capital punishment? And I'll never forget this day because it was quite formative. And I decided, my 13-year-old self decided, yes, there are some offenses that should be punishable. And then, many years later, when I had a little more nuance, I realized how fundamentally disturbing it is that the state, which is ostensibly supposed to be an institution that protects its citizens, will also sentence them to death. And that's when I became anti-death penalty. When we talk about capital punishment, we talk about the execution, the regimentation, the structure of its citizens. What about how the state can execute a procedure against people from other countries? Is it the same principle of capital punishment? If the state is meant to protect its own citizens, then what about the citizens of the world? Other people? I've become very anti-war, very anti-violence. And again, when I was younger and not fully aware of politics and things like that, I had a more kind of American militaristic mentality. I remember I once said, I'm okay with trillions of dollars being distributed from our tax dollars to the military-industrial complex because I know I can sleep safe at night. 13-year-old me was quite naive, wasn't she? What's going on between the US and Ukraine, Russia, negotiations. Don't even bring up Palestine. It's one of those things where it does take a certain amount of maturity to understand why funneling a bunch of money into disciplining and punishing even enemies of the state. Because very quickly, the foreign enemies can become domestic enemies. And we see this right now with our current administration. Now, I think personally the first month of Trump's new presidency has been a complete disaster. I think it's been more so than even I anticipated. Do you know how I felt when I woke up one morning and I discovered that they were going to rename Greenland to Red, White, and Blue Land? The sheer embarrassment. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's what it's like to be under Trump. Constant, unceasing embarrassment. That's right, yeah. I used to be very patriotic about America. I'm just thinking about the inherent militarism in the United States. How we have this iron fist abroad. And this is not news to people who are living in the global south. And this is not news at all. Understand. I mean, in some countries, the only way they know about the United States is they see it printed on the bombs. Made in the USA. So what is a military landscape? What are the borders and perimeters that define what a military landscape is? The logistics, the spatialities. And it's more than just a battlefield. I was reading recently War and Peace. I decided to read it just because I thought it was long and boring. And I actually liked it. But I want to read more interesting books, but I just want to get through it because I just want to say I read War and Peace. And I find it interesting how I learned so much about early 19th century warfare, with their little muskets. Constantly talk about their muskets. It was actually interesting because I actually didn't know anything about the Napoleonic Wars, really. But it made me think about war, specifically from the male perspective, which is interesting because, I'm a feminist. I read a lot of feminist literature, but I find it so interesting how futile the war is. In War and Peace, and they talk about how these soldiers, even if they're mildly injured on a battlefield, infection takes them. And you realize how war and masculinity are one and the same. The reason why I never really bought the whole idea of, machismo is because it's grooming men to be soldiers. Very obviously. Don't cry, promoting violence. There is very little, I think, and again, a lot of people might disagree with me on this. Well, that's not healthy masculinity, or it is healthy masculinity to... No, I think the way we raise young boys is absolutely we are grooming a soldier. And in War and Peace, funny, I'm talking a lot about literature, and I normally don't. These aristocrats have really nothing going on in their life. They are bored. They have serfs that attend to their every whim. They have these large estates, and they do nothing except for socializing all day long. It's boring. I mean, it's better than being a serf. It's better than being a man who's stuck in a barrack for the majority of his life. But they go to war, and they get certain privileges. They get, special horses and special, rooming accommodations because they're rich. And even then, it's not idealistic for them. This is back when high-ranking military officers, generals, they were on the battlefield. They were in the line of fire. And, there was not this idea of the person who has the cushy job away from the battlefield. They were on the battlefield. So when we talk about the parameters of military landscapes, the last couple of years there's been a lot of debate about statues. What statues do we have that commemorate things and, what don't? What we should dismantle. I know during the Black Lives Matter protests, a lot of statues were eliminated and torn down. I actually, even in the UK, they had that, which I found interesting. Black Lives Matter was a worldwide movement. Too bad no one stuck with it who wasn't in the anti-police brutality, Black community, whatever. I find that to be just typical. But anyway, I think this was in Liverpool, actually. It was and Liverpool was a slave trading port. And they dismantled all these statues, but it was a worldwide movement to tear down these statues, to tear down militarism. And I think that militarism, military landscapes is a lot more than just two sides that are fighting. In the kind of traditional, we agree to meet on this battlefield. We have a set time and place. We have the drums. We have the band. They used to have, in the Revolutionary War, they had the fifes. That's actually laughable today. But it was seen as the height of grandeur. It was seen as a very respectable thing. And it's not. It's never been a respectable thing. I talk a lot about, the state's regulation of women's bodies. But the state also regulates men's bodies. And one of the ways it does it is through militarism and the grooming of the soldier. Mandatory conscription, I think, is the gendered state punishment of the male. I mean, you have in Israel, where both men and women are conscripted, but that's a rare exception. And that's really only because they need complete mobilization of their population, because, they don't have a lot of people. And masculinity culminates in military service a lot of times in many cultures, and even in places in the United States. Although we don't have that same expectation of mandatory conscription since the ending of the draft in the 1970s. You have a lot of places where if you evade military service, you're seen as a coward. You're seen as not a real man. You're seen as a traitor to the state. And I think that's ridiculous. I think there's nothing more strong than resisting partaking in state-sanctioned violence, personally. But it is all about this idea of brutality that is innate to the male experience. And you see a lot of grooming of young boys. This is a very controversial subject, but I will throw it out here. If we look at the kind of toys that boys play with, it's, Call of Duty, which is basically U.S. military propaganda. Let's be honest. You have very, they're play fighting. Not just play fighting, roughhousing, like, everyone does that. But I mean, specifically this kind of state-sanctioned role play. And that bothers me. It really does. The desensitization of young boys to violence is how they're primed for military service. And again, this is a bit of a class issue too, and a racial one as well, because men of status, they don't have to put themselves on the line. It's an option for them. At least when war had a little bit more of a decorum and they had like the pretty lapels or lapels, no, lapels, what is it called? Little fringy things. I read the book, I promise. But is it not capital punishment if a boy of 18 or 19 is shot by the state, by the enemy of the state, protecting its interests? Is it not capital punishment? Is it not capital punishment if a young boy is, against his will, against his bodily autonomy, is serviced draft papers, has to endure weeks of boot camp, couldn't think of the word boot camp, weeks of boot camp to strengthen his body and, break him down mentally and build him up in the image of the, they're basically making you into an automaton, a killing machine. Is that not capital punishment if that results in you getting, unalived? I'm still on TikTok, I promise. On real podcasts, I don't say this in real life. Is that not capital punishment? What I find very interesting and something Foucault mentions in his book, he talks about how there are lots of psychiatric professionals, educators, doctors that attend to the condemned. Why is it that we kind of nourish the body and the mind and the soul right up until the moment of state-sanctioned execution? And I think that a lot of it is kind of, he talks about the reticence to inflict capital punishment. The kind of contradictory nature, the fact that it's kind of spread out among different departments of the state. It's not all concentrated in one area. You have prisoners who are on death row who are, if they have a medical complication, they will be treated right up until the moment of their execution date. This reminds me of boot camp. This reminds me of the military. They will nourish their soldiers. They will make sure that they're strong enough to have a fighting chance, but ultimately, when that execution date arrives, no doctor in sight. And that's what I think. We need to broaden the definition of capital punishment, especially because we are entering a more militarized era. Isn't it obvious? Part of the reason why I'm so skeptical of gender roles is not just because of women, it's because of men too. Patriarchy is fundamentally, the fundamental principle of it is war. It's how it's able to legitimize itself as a government. You'll often hear people who are saying why they don't think women should have the right to vote. They will often make the argument, almost invariably make the argument, that because men are mandatorily conscripted, and by the way, they're not in the U.S. anymore, although it could be reinstated at a moment's notice. And by the way, even if it was reinstated, most likely women would be conscripted as well. They may not meet the physical requirements, but at least a few would. And they'd be sent to God knows where. So kind of the anti-suffrage argument for women is that women are not conscripted by the state. Therefore, by the way, no one's conscripted by the state in the United States. Whatever. So, therefore, men should have voting rights because they're the ones who are putting their lives and bodies on the line. And by the way, to that I say, and I hate to kind of appeal to reproduction when I'm talking about double standards, but men's bodies are being exploited by the state and so are women's. So, and Marxist feminism talks a lot about this, how women are essentially breeding a workforce. Is it not a woman giving up her body to the state as well? If she has to repopulate for the next generation, she has to endure 9 months of pregnancy. Birth is horrific almost invariably. Why is that not service to the state? Why does that not grant voting rights? But militarism does. And that's because of violence. Another aspect of patriarchy is regimentation. And we think about the duality of the word regiment. Because on the one hand, it means, structure. It means, it means to have in an orderly fashion, kind of, regulation. And then on the other, it's a military unit. That double meaning is not coincidental. It is directly related to the other. There's been a lot of discussions the last couple of years about kind of the idea of cleanliness, the idea of rigid timetables and structures, and how, some people really do like those things. Some people really love, and by the way, if you're anyone who isn't someone who wakes up at 6 a.m. and goes to bed at 9 p.m., people think that you have an incorrect sleeping schedule, which I find ridiculous. And look at me, it's 4:41 in the morning for me, and I'm wide awake. But anyway, so when we think about timetables and structures and regimentation, it's not for your benefit. It's for the benefit of the people who are governing you. So you can be predictable. So you can, in the words of Foucault, condition yourself to be a docile body. You can self-surveillance. And that's why you see people just absolutely beating themselves up. I need to be more productive. She had a whole video a couple months back about how I hate the word productive. I need to be more productive. I need to be more structured. I need to go to bed at a certain time. I need to, have a routine. And for some people who are more, I do hate to say this because I am very anti-hierarchy overall, but I do think there are some people who thrive in hierarchy. I don't know who exactly those people are, but there are people who, when they see structure and regimentation and a clear, hierarchy that they can potentially scale, or even if they kind of take the more beta position, they become, they love it. I had an incident, maybe not super recently, but, not super far away either, where I had someone who was surveillancing me when I was performing a task at a job I had. And it just reminded me of the and I'd already read Foucault, so I was kind of aware of this concept, and she kind of loomed in the corner watching me, and I thought, okay, this is discipline and punish right before my eyes. Sure enough, the tiniest infraction resulted in my immediate execution, my expulsion from this position. And I thought to myself, she is part of the hierarchy. She is part of the panopticon. She is someone who likes having power and surveillance. And by the way, I later found out that this person also resulted in other people getting fired unfairly. So I wasn't the only victim. But you see it, and Foucault talks about how a lot of times privilege is framed as like owning property. There are so many ideas in this book. It's kind of like contractual agreement. And in reality, it's like a network. It's like everyone kind of participates a little bit in this power structure. The state ruling its citizens and the people who are oppressed, or, whatever other system of oppression. More like it's an integral web where a lot of people are caught up in it, and they get certain advantages, and and if they align themselves and they get part of this hierarchy and being kind of the pyramid that holds it up, they get some kind of inadvertent privilege from that, even if ultimately it's not making them free. And I've just seen this so often in my own life of people reinforcing stringent hierarchies and selling the people at the bottom out because it's survival. If it's not you, it's them. And that's part of the reason why when you're a young person first entering the workforce, it is so brutally, it's brutal because you're seen as kind of an outsider. Who is this person who barely has a resume? They haven't been certified by the corporatocracy as reliable, regimented employees. And I think also about the word disorder. I actually meant to put this in maybe my last video, but I ended up forgetting to put this in. But the word disorder is also a very interesting parallel, double meaning, polarity, duality, binary. The twos. The king has two bodies. Yeah, that was not scripted. Okay. Anyway. So the word disorder, it simultaneously means chaos, non-regimented, unstructured. And it also means illness, either of the body or the mind. More frequently the mind, I think. And I find it interesting that we associate chaos and kind of a more relaxed regimentation with illness, lack of cleanliness, disease, something that needs to be fixed, something that needs to be fenced in, something that needs to be corrected, standardized. You have a disorder because you are not regimented. You need to be part of a regiment, at once a military unit, but it also is a reflection of something much deeper, which is all about the regulation and the control of our bodies on so many levels. The thing is, if you're someone who likes to kind of inspect how society really works, you will never find enough ways that you are oppressed. And it more than just, the things everyone kind of knows. But it can be something as seemingly ordinary as someone watching over you at your job and then unfairly getting you fired because they're reinforcing the system of power. It can be something as ordinary as you feeling like you are incorrect because you don't adhere to a strict schedule, because you are not patterning yourself off of the military. And something I always wondered about psychology, and a lot of people, when I say I'm critical of psychology, a lot of people are like, what do you mean you're critical of psychology? Psychology assumes that the average is what everyone should adhere to, that there is, what comes to my mind is the attachment theory, which I'm going to say I can't stand, where it's like, you have normal attachment, which is healthy attachment, and then you have the disorders. But I find it so interesting how deep in psychological theory, you have this concept of chaos and unpredictability as illness, just in the word disorder alone. And I think that sometimes we just take this so for granted, because if you are structured, if you are regimented, you are a predictable category for the state. You pay your bills on time. You, what are other ways? You get to work right at 9 o'clock. You are predictable. No one is worried about you becoming a threat or enemy of the state. Because if you are structured and regimented within a certain gender expectation, and by the way, if you don't think gender roles are supposed to be ultimately servicing the best interest of the state, what we talked about in this podcast is the idea of capital punishment. More than just the overt violence of, bombings and the kind of overt military aggression. And yes, even though technically Trump does kind of position himself as a bit of, isolationist, he does talk about kind of pulling out of the Middle East. He's not. He's not. I mean, building Trump Towers in Gaza, that's not pulling out of the Middle East. We talked about capital punishment, more than just the idea of state-sanctioned executions, but also execution in general, kind of regiment, kind of how militaristic language does bleed into kind of what's seen as an orderly society. And if you are someone who is not fitting into these stringent categories that are placed into you, then you are labeled, you are defined as having a disorder. Ironically, which is why I don't like categorizations. I think I made a video about how I don't like things like, psychological typing and, even to a certain extent, the whole concept of mental disorders. We are kind of containing disorder. We are labeling it. We are defining it. We are making it predictable so we can know how to manage it in a very procedural way. And the problem I have with it, and yes, there is kind of a more practical side of it, which is that if you have a genuine issue, you need to get medical attention. Like, as someone who most likely has attention deficit hyperactive disorder, is that really a disorder? Or is it just a difference in thinking? I think it's a difference in thinking. I think there's nothing necessarily wrong with me. I just don't necessarily fit into these procedural structural lifestyle. It's not necessarily that there's anything wrong with you in isolation. It's that you don't interact with the larger society in a way that's seen as harmonious so you can be a docile body and blend in with the crowd. So, it's funny how we're trying to define disorder, which is fundamentally something that cannot be defined, something that's indefinable. And personally, I can't create on a schedule. And that's something I mean, I suffer a lot because of that reality. But I don't necessarily believe in this concept of disorder. I believe that you can be sick. I believe you can have diseases, but I don't believe in this fundamentally in disorder. Because it all goes back to the grooming of people to become mindless automatons for the state. And if you think anything otherwise, then why is it that doctors and psychologists will treat a patient on death row for a disorder until capital punishment is inflicted?